Imagine believing your enemy would never have the courage to face you on equal terms. Imagine entering a war convinced that victory was already guaranteed, even before the first shot was fired. In the summer of 1942, that was exactly what many of the top commanders of the Japanese Empire thought about the United States. For them, Americans were a people accustomed to comfort, consumption, and the easy life. They were men who drove automobiles, went to the movies, worked in modern factories, and would never understand the true meaning of sacrifice. In the Japanese view, those young Marines did not possess enough discipline to endure months of hunger, disease, fear, and hand-to-hand combat in a tropical jungle. They believed a fierce attack, conducted with the determination of the Bushido Code, would completely break the Marines' will to fight. It was a conviction built over years of overwhelming victories, fueled by military propaganda and reinforced by rapid Japanese expansion across the Pacific. But there was a problem. This conviction was about to be tested in the cruelest place any of them could imagine. Long before Guadalcanal became a famous name in history books, that small island in the Solomon Islands was just another piece of land covered by almost impenetrable vegetation. The suffocating heat made the air feel heavy. Moisture penetrated clothes, weapons, and even the soldiers' and thoughts. Massive trees hid the sky, while vines, swamps, and narrow rivers turned any movement into an exhausting effort. Malaria-carrying mosquitoes formed constant clouds over the forest, and rain fell almost every day, turning trails into deep mud. There were no proper roads, no major cities, no comfort. It was an environment that seemed to fight against any human being who dared to stay there for long. And in that very inhospitable setting, the future of the Pacific War would be decided. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japan had won an impressive sequence of victories. In a few months, its forces advanced through Hong Kong, Malaya, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and countless Pacific islands. British bases considered impregnable fell with a speed that surprised the world. Singapore, called the Gibraltar of the East, surrendered in February 1942, representing one of the greatest defeats in British military history. In the Philippines, American and Filipino troops were forced to retreat after months of desperate resistance. In all these combats, the Japanese commanders concluded that their military doctrine was correct. The fighting spirit overcame any industrial advantage of the enemy. This confidence had deep roots in Japanese military culture. Since the beginning of the 20th century, officers were educated according to a strict interpretation of Bushido, the ancient code of the samurai. Absolute loyalty to the emperor, the readiness to die without hesitation, and the belief that surrender was a dishonor shaped every aspect of training. Soldiers learned that enduring extreme suffering was a demonstration of spiritual strength. They slept little, received limited food during exercises, and were subjected to extremely severe physical training. Many officers sincerely believed that American soldiers would never withstand this type of pressure. In their view, a democratic and materialistic society produced comfortable men, incapable of fighting to the death. This perception was reinforced by propaganda. Military magazines, speeches, and reports frequently described Americans as physically strong, but emotionally weak. It was believed that in the face of high losses, they would quickly lose the will to continue fighting. It was an analysis based on stereotypes, not reality. And it would be precisely this mistaken assessment that would cost Japan tens of thousands of lives. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, the United States was undergoing an unprecedented transformation. After the shock caused by Pearl Harbor, factories began operating day and night, producing ships, planes, tanks, and weapons on an unseen scale. Young people from all regions of the country showed up to serve. Many had never left their hometowns. Farmers, students, mechanics, teachers, and workers began to wear the uniform of the Marine Corps. They were ordinary men, but they carried with them enormous determination after the attack that had shaken the entire nation. Among these men was the 1st Marine Division. Although it still had little experience in major amphibious operations, it would be charged with a mission considered extremely risky: attacking Guadalcanal. Reconnaissance information indicated the Japanese were building an airfield on the island. If that strip was completed, Japanese planes could threaten the communication lines between the United States and Australia, putting the entire Allied strategy in the Pacific at risk. The decision was made quickly. In August 1942, a large American naval force crossed the Pacific toward the Solomon Islands. On board the ships, thousands of Marines watched the horizon without knowing exactly what they would find. Many believed they would face only a small garrison. Others had the strange feeling that they were entering something much bigger than any training could prepare them for. The silence among the men was interrupted only by the constant noise of the engines and the swaying of the waves. Some wrote letters to their families. Others cleaned their weapons repeatedly, trying to control their anxiety. Everyone knew that, from then on, nothing would ever be the same. On the morning of August 7, 1942, landing craft began to slowly advance toward the coast of Guadalcanal. A thin mist covered part of the island, while vegetation completely hid the interior of that unknown territory. Each meter covered increased the tension. The Marines expected to be met by intense enemy fire at any moment. But surprisingly, it did not happen. The initial landing met little resistance. The Japanese on the island were few and did not expect an American offensive of that magnitude. Quickly, the Marines advanced and captured the airfield still under construction, which would receive the name Henderson Field. At that moment, few imagined that Henderson Field would transform into the most disputed objective of the entire campaign. Whoever controlled Henderson Field would control the skies over Guadalcanal, and whoever controlled the skies would have enormous advantages to supply their troops and attack enemy ships. Without realizing it, Americans and Japanese began a struggle that would last for months and change the course of the Pacific War forever. In the first days after the capture of Henderson Field, a curious feeling began to take hold of the Marines. The operation had been too fast. The landing had occurred with much less resistance than everyone expected. Some came to believe that American intelligence had overestimated the Japanese presence on the island. The silence of the jungle seemed to confirm this impression. During the day, only the singing of tropical birds and the incessant buzzing of insects broke the monotony of that suffocating environment. At night, however, everything changed. The forest came to life in a disturbing way. Distant noises echoed between the trees, branches broke for no apparent reason, and shadows seemed to move in absolute darkness. Many soldiers spent hours clutching their rifles, staring into the woods, convinced there was someone watching their every move. And most of the time, they were right. While the Americans worked frantically to complete Henderson Field and organize their defensive positions, Japanese officials analyzed reports coming from Guadalcanal. The first pieces of information were confusing. The speed of the American attack had completely surprised the Japanese command. Still in Tokyo, few believed that this invasion represented a serious threat. Many generals were convinced it was only a limited incursion, carried out by a small and poorly prepared force. It would be enough to send an experienced detachment to drive the invaders back to the sea. It was in this context that a name emerged that would be forever marked in the history of the campaign: Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki. Ichiki was considered a disciplined, respected, and extremely confident officer. A veteran of previous campaigns, he deeply believed in the superiority of the Japanese soldier. When he received the mission to recover Guadalcanal, he showed no concern. In fact, he saw the operation as an opportunity to prove once again the strength of the Imperial Army. His superiors shared this optimism. Estimates suggested that only a few thousand Americans occupied the island, and that most of them would flee in the face of an aggressive attack. But there was a crucial detail. The information was completely wrong. Instead of waiting for reinforcements and organizing a coordinated offensive, Ichiki made a decision that would change the fate of his men. Convinced he would face a weak enemy, he resolved to attack immediately with only part of his regiment. It was a gamble based not on military intelligence, but on the belief that courage and aggressiveness would be enough to compensate for any numerical disadvantage. Meanwhile, on the American side, reality began to show its cruelest face. The heat was almost unbearable. Uniforms remained soaked for whole days. Boots never dried completely. Weapons rusted in a matter of hours because of the constant humidity. Food was rationed. Drinking water became a precious resource. Malaria began to spread rapidly among the soldiers. Strong men, who a few days before landed full of energy, now trembled with fever, vomited, and could barely stand. Some said the jungle was a much more dangerous enemy than any Japanese soldier. And then came the first patrols. Small American groups began to disappear into the dense forest on reconnaissance missions. Some teams returned bringing worrying information, recent footprints, abandoned camps, hidden equipment, remains of fires still warm. It became evident that Japanese forces were slowly approaching, using the forest as cover. The tension increased every day. However, no one imagined the speed with which the first major attack would happen. On the night of August 20th to 21, 1942, the silence was interrupted by isolated shots near the Tenaru River. A few seconds later, explosions lit up the darkness. The Japanese had begun their offensive. Guided by Ichiki, hundreds of soldiers advanced directly against the American positions. Shouting orders and trusting in the strength of the frontal attack, they believed they would quickly break through the Marines' defensive line. It was exactly the type of offensive that had worked in several previous campaigns. But Guadalcanal was not China. It was not Malaya. And those men entrenched before them would not react in the expected way. As soon as the first Japanese appeared on the riverbank, American machine guns opened fire. The flash of the shots tore through the darkness, while bullets crossed the field in all directions. Grenades exploded among the Japanese ranks. Mortars hit entire groups before they could even cross the sandbar. Still, the soldiers continued advancing. It was an impressive demonstration of courage. Even seeing comrades falling beside them, they continued running toward the American positions. Some managed to reach the barbed wire before being hit. Others tried to cross the river under intense enemy fire. Officers shouted to maintain the attack, convinced that one more effort would be enough to break the defense. But that moment never came. For hours, successive waves of Japanese soldiers advanced practically along the same path, being received by a devastating barrier of crossfire. The Marines, protected by carefully prepared trenches, maintained impressive discipline. Each machine gun covered a specific sector. Each mortar already had previously registered targets. When dawn began to break over Guadalcanal, the scene was almost impossible to describe. The riverbank was covered with bodies. Destroyed equipment, scattered rifles, abandoned helmets, and trees marked by thousands of bullet impacts transformed the landscape into a portrait of disaster. The attack that was supposed to quickly drive out the Americans had ended in a catastrophe for the Imperial Army. But the battle had not yet ended. Realizing that the Japanese offensive had lost strength, the Marines began a counterattack. Light tanks advanced slowly through the sand while infantry groups surrounded the survivors. Many Japanese soldiers refused any possibility of surrender. They continued fighting until the last moment, faithful to the training they had received throughout their lives. When the combat finally ended, almost all of Ichiki's detachment had been destroyed. The colonel himself died in the final hours of the battle. His plan, based on the conviction that Americans were weak soldiers incapable of resisting a determined attack, had failed completely. On that day, something much bigger than a simple battle happened. For the first time since the start of the war, a major Japanese land attack had been decisively crushed by American Marines. The news quickly reached the Japanese commanders. But instead of accepting that they had underestimated the enemy, many reached a different conclusion. They believed Ichiki had lost simply because he did not have enough men. The idea that the Marines could be opponents as disciplined as the Japanese soldiers themselves still seemed impossible to accept. And it was exactly this error of judgment that would push thousands of other soldiers into the same jungle, where an even more brutal battle was about to begin. To be continued. Dawn revealed a scene that would remain engraved forever in the memory of the men who survived the Battle of the Tenaru. Smoke still rose slowly among the burned trees, while the smell of gunpowder mixed with the heavy odor of mud, blood, and destroyed vegetation. The silence that took hold of the battlefield seemed almost unreal. Hours before, that same place had been taken over by screams, explosions, and incessant shots. Now only a few birds timidly returned to sing, as if nature itself were trying to hide the violence that had happened during the night. Marines walked slowly among the enemy positions, looking for survivors and collecting equipment. Many had never seen a battle of that intensity. Some were veterans of rigorous training, but no exercise could prepare them for the reality they found before their eyes. The number of Japanese dead impressed even the most experienced soldiers. The frontal attack led by Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki had practically destroyed his entire fighting force. Among American officers, the feeling was contradictory. There was relief at having resisted the first major Japanese counterattack, but there was also concern. If a relatively small force had managed to get so close to Henderson Field, what would happen when Japan sent an entire army? That question would not take long to be answered. On the other side of the Pacific, the first reports reached the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. The messages were confusing, fragmented, and hard to believe. For hours, some officers thought there had been a communication error. How could an experienced detachment, commanded by a respected officer like Ichiki, have been practically annihilated by those same Americans that so many judged incapable of facing a prolonged war? The answer seemed too simple to be accepted. Instead of recognizing that they had completely underestimated the enemy, many commanders preferred to believe that Ichiki had committed individual errors. In their view, the problem was not the strength of the Marines, but the fact that the colonel had attacked before the arrival of the rest of his troops. This conclusion would have devastating consequences. Instead of abandoning their initial view of the Americans, the High Command decided to send even more soldiers to Guadalcanal. The order was clear: recover Henderson Field at any cost. Meanwhile, the reality of the Marines worsened every day. Winning a battle did not mean winning the war. Supplies arrived slowly. The American Navy faced constant attacks from Japanese submarines and planes. Supply ships needed to unload ammunition, food, and fuel as quickly as possible before leaving the island. Many times, huge amounts of material were abandoned on the beach simply because there was not enough time to transport them to the warehouses. Food began to run short. Meals, which were already simple, became even smaller. Canned goods were shared among several men. Some soldiers said they dreamed only of a piece of fresh bread or a hot cup of coffee. Others lost so much weight that their uniforms seemed too wide. But hunger was only one of the enemies. Malaria spread without any mercy. Mosquitoes dominated Guadalcanal. At the end of the afternoon, huge clouds of insects covered practically the entire region near the swamps. A few minutes without protection were enough for arms, neck, and face to be completely covered with bites. In a few days, dozens of Marines began to show intense fevers, chills, muscle pains, and a fatigue so profound that they could barely lift their rifles. Some men shook uncontrollably even under a suffocating heat of over 30 degrees. Others fainted during patrols. There were soldiers who needed to be carried by their own companions because they simply could not walk anymore. Doctors did what they could using quinine and other available medications, but resources were limited. Many times it was impossible to know if a man would die from an enemy bullet or from a disease transmitted by a simple mosquito. The Japanese also suffered. In fact, they were beginning to face even greater difficulties. To supply Guadalcanal, the Imperial Navy began to use fast destroyers that sailed during the night at high speed. The Americans soon nicknamed these missions the Tokyo Express. Under the protection of darkness, Japanese vessels unloaded soldiers, ammunition, and part of the supplies before disappearing again at dawn to avoid attacks from the aviation based at Henderson Field. It was an extremely risky operation. The destroyers were fast but had little space to transport heavy food, fuel, and equipment. The priority was to take men to the island. As a consequence, thousands of soldiers landed carrying only small amounts of food. In the beginning, few realized the size of this problem. Without an efficient supply line, each new reinforcement further increased the consumption of the limited resources available. In a few weeks, Japanese soldiers began to survive on minimal portions of rice. Some supplemented their diet with coconuts, roots, leaves, and any animal they could capture in the jungle. Hunger slowly began to transform into an invisible weapon. Meanwhile, Henderson Field remained operational day and night. American pilots took off constantly to intercept enemy convoys, attack ships, and prevent reinforcements from arriving in sufficient quantity. The runway, initially built by the Japanese, had transformed into the heart of American resistance. The men who operated that airfield came to be known as the Cactus Air Force, a reference to the code name used by the Allies for Guadalcanal, Operation Cactus. With each plane that landed bringing ammunition or took off to face Japanese fighters, it became increasingly evident that the battle for the island was far from over. But there was another problem. The Japanese had learned an important lesson. Frontal attacks during the day had failed. Now they would completely change their way of fighting. When the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the forest plunged into absolute darkness, small groups of Japanese soldiers began to silently infiltrate through the woods. There were no flashlights, no conversations, no noise other than the sound of rain and insects. Many Marines woke up in the middle of the night, hearing only a branch breaking in the distance. Others swore they heard footsteps around the trenches. It was impossible to distinguish where fear ended and reality began. The Japanese became masters at using the jungle itself as a psychological weapon. Patrols disappeared. Outposts stopped responding. Sometimes a single shot echoed through the entire night, forcing hundreds of men to remain awake until dawn. The mental wear was devastating. Sleep became a luxury. The soldiers lived in a permanent state of alert. Some could no longer remember when they had spent an entire night without expecting a surprise attack. And while Americans and Japanese fought this silent battle against fear, a new Japanese commander landed on the island with thousands of men. His goal was simple: destroy Henderson Field, annihilate the Marines, and prove to the world that Ichikid's defeat had been just an accident. Without either side knowing, the bloodiest battle of the entire campaign was about to begin on the hill south of the airfield, a place that, a short time later, would enter history with a name impossible to forget. Bloody Ridge. To be continued.